Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this distinguished lecture. Today, we are bringing to you the Kongsi-RSIS School of International Study Distinguished Public Lecture by Professor Stephen Roach. It is my pleasure to say a few words on Dr. Roach. As you all have read from the invitation and publicity notices, Dr. Roach is now at Yale University. He is Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, as well as Senior Lecturer at the School of Management at Yale University. All of you also know that he was previously Chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. Morgan Stanley, as all of you know, is a big investment management firm operating here in Singapore as well as in China and all over Asia. Dr. Roach is an esteemed economist, and now he spends some time in academic domain, and I was just talking to him. He has spent time teaching students and continuing his interest in Asian economic development and other matters relating to China. We are going to listen to Dr. Roach today on the US-China relationship, from conflict to resolution. All of you would appreciate that this particular relationship between China and the United States of America is a major relationship, very important to the world as we know it. And therefore, we are all interested in how this relationship will develop in the coming months and years. At the moment, the United States of America and China are embroiled in a competitive situation. Some people hope that the relationship and the atmosphere will be better after President Donald Trump left the scene and President Joe Biden has taken over. But unfortunately, their removal of tariffs to speed up the trade between the two countries have been going very slowly, and fresh points on areas like trade, technology, and most recently Taiwan threaten to further debilitate the China-US relationship. On top of that, we are grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have a lot of challenges day in, day out as new variants appear on the scene. So the countries in the world are working together to keep populations safe, distribute vaccines, and try to rebuild their respective economies. The United States and China appear to have more to disagree on all these issues than agree on the need for strengthened cooperation on these areas. The current consensus in the United States is that at the same time, China's existence and growth is a fact. How do we navigate this increasingly adversarial strategic environment between these two powers? We will look forward to Professor Roach's presentation, and hopefully he can give us some ideas of what to expect in the coming months. As I said just now, Dr. Roach is well known to many of us, and he has continued to maintain his interest in China and Asia. Hopefully, we will be able to see him very soon in Singapore if the restriction coming out from the COVID-19 pandemic can be eased. In fact, we have Professor Roach as our Ngee Kongsi professor at RSIS, and we look forward to seeing him in person as soon as the COVID-19 situation allows more travel to take place. My last word is a bit about Ngee Kongsi. Ngee Kongsi is a Singaporean charitable foundation focused a lot on education, and we are very honored to host one of the endowment fund created by Ngee Kongsi for the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and we use this to organize distinguished lecture like this and to host distinguished experts like Dr. Stephen Roach at our school. So thank you very much to colleagues at the Ngee Kongsi, whom I'm told are also watching you, Professor Roach. Yeah, and I think I should now pass the screen to you, sir. Over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. It's a pleasure to address all of you today. I do miss my travels to Singapore. I've been going to Singapore off and on now for about 25 years. I've had opportunity to build great relationships over the years in Singapore, and I'm looking forward to returning there as soon as we get through this extraordinary period. Just one, brief sort of sense of background on what has taken me into this area of focusing on the U.S.-China economic relationship. I've been studying this relationship now for close to 20 years. And I wrote a book about it about 5 years ago. And I'm hard at work right now writing another book that I hope to finish in the next couple of months on the latest twists and turns in this relationship. I spent 30 years at Morgan Stanley. The first half of that, I was focused on the United States. The second half of that, I was focused on Asia, and in particular, China. And during that latter part of my career at Morgan Stanley, I became very involved with the Chinese leadership in discussing US perceptions of China. And I was able to speak at a very senior level in their leadership structure about my views on China as seen through the US lens. And that's when I had the idea that my knowledge of the US, together with my experience in China, the intersection of the two was of enormous interest to me and of considerable value to government officials in both countries. And so my focus has been not as much on the US economy as it used to be, not even as much on the Chinese economy per se as it has been, but on the intersection of the two, how they fit together, the stresses and strains, the challenges, the contrasts, and the similarities. And that's the perspective that I want to bring to you today in this lecture. I agree with your characterization, Ambassador Ong, that this is the world's most important bilateral economic relationship, not just because these are the two largest economies in the world now, but because they're both, the US and China, so heavily integrated with the rest of the world. These are the two engines in the world. And without either one and the interplay between them, the world economy would be struggling for leadership, for growth, and cohesion. So there's a lot at stake in this relationship, and I will start out by stating the obvious, that this relationship, after coming together with a lot of hope and optimism in the 1970s, especially after the diplomatic efforts of President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and the Chinese counterparts, Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. The hope has now turned into conflict. The relationship is in serious trouble. And my concern right now is if both sides don't come together and recognize what's at risk, this relationship is going to go from bad to worse. We've had now a trade war basically for a little over 3 years. It quickly turned into a tech war where we're fighting over each other's proprietary technologies. And Henry Kissinger said about a year ago that he was concerned that the US and China have moved into the early stages of a Cold War. That would be not only a huge disappointment, but a very disturbing possibility if it turns out to be correct. And I want to start on this point of potential conflict. I would define a Cold War as a clash between two systems on matters of trade, technology, human rights, and geostrategic power projection. I think in all of those areas, the US and China are in a state of conflict to one degree or another. But I think we have to be careful here. We had one Cold War. It lasted 44 years, from 1947 to 1991, between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Whenever you hear the words Cold War today, we think back to that earlier period. And we know how it ended. And so there's a view that, well, if there's another Cold War, it'll probably end the same way. America will triumph and China will lose. And what does it mean if that turns out to be correct? Or what does that mean if it turns out to be wrong? There are enormous consequences to the answers to those questions. The point that I want to make on this Cold War, though, is that whatever the outcome, and I think right now it's not altogether clear what any potential outcome would actually be, that if in fact we are in a Cold War, it's a very different Cold War than it was from 1947 to 1991. There are two major differences that I would draw to your attention at the outset. One, sharp contrasts in the growth characteristics of both combatants. in the first Cold War, the US was strong, and the Soviet Union was progressively weaker. In the second Cold War, if this is in fact where we are, the US is considerably weaker from an economic point of view than it was back then. Whereas China is progressively stronger in meeting the challenges of the United States than the Soviet Union was from 1944 to 1971. Let me just give you some numbers. And I'm going to compare the United States with its performance in the first Cold War with its performance over the last 10 years, just to give you a sense of how different the state of the US economy is today vis-a-vis what it was back then. GDP growth in the first Cold War averaged 3.5% a year for 44 years. In the last 10 years, the growth rate has been half that, 1.7. Productivity growth, probably the most important characteristic that drives the potential of any economy. In the first Cold War, US productivity growth averaged 2.2% per year. In the past 10 years, it's been half that, 1.1. Saving. The United States saved a large portion of its national income during the first Cold War. The domestic savings rate, this is the total savings rate for the United States, businesses, households, and the government sector, adjusted for depreciation. The net domestic savings rate averaged nearly 9% during the first Cold War. We had the wherewithal to fund our economy through domestic saving. In the last 10 years, the number has not been nearly 9, but it's been slightly below 3. We're lacking in saving. And that's very important in trying to understand our capacity to fund our future economic growth. I'll come back to this point later on. Our current account balance with the rest of the world during the first Cold War was basically zero, a slight positive surplus. And yet in the last 10 years, we've had an average current account deficit of 2.3% of GDP. And the same is true of foreign trade, which is the largest piece of our balance of payments. Slight deficit during the first Cold War, and a deficit that averaged about 3% of GDP in the last 10 years. So as you can see from those comparisons, GDP, productivity, saving, the current account, the trade deficit, we are in considerably weaker state of affairs today relative to where we were back then. So the idea that we're well positioned and can wage a Cold War from the comparable position of economic strength that we were able to muster back then is not the case today. If in fact we are moving into a Cold War, we are moving in to that type of conflict in a position of relative weakness especially when compared with the relative strength of our adversary, China, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The second difference between the first Cold War and the possibility that we're in a second one right now is the nature of the relationship between the two conflicted parties. In the first Cold War, there was really no meaningful relationship from an economic point of view between the United States and the former Soviet Union. In fact, the former Soviet Union had strong relationships with its satellite countries, initially with China, but that broke down in the 1960s, but was largely independent of the economies in the West. Today, US and China, up until recently, and in some respects still today, there's a strong legacy of a tight relationship between the US and Chinese economies. I've described this relationship as a relationship of interdependence. The title of my last book characterized this relationship as a relationship of codependency. The US depended on China, China depended on the US. I found that when I talked about this in China and in Washington, it got government officials uncomfortable to hear me speak of a mutual interdependency. But you look at the numbers, they support that very much. China, of course, was heavily dependent on US demand for its exports. And China had an export-led economic takeoff in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. And America was either the first or the second largest market for the engine of China's development takeoff. So there's no mistaking China's reliance on the US. But the US also was hugely dependent on China for the sustenance of its economic growth as well in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. American consumers, for example, their incomes were under extraordinary pressure, and they were expanded by our purchases of low-cost Chinese products. China's markets themselves over the last 15 years became our third largest export market in the United States, behind our two North American partners, Canada and Mexico. And it was by far the most rapidly growing export market for the United States as well. And then finally, of course, China bought our treasuries. We run chronic budget deficits. We need foreign purchases of treasuries to support our budget deficits. And China today owns 1.1, 1.2 trillion of US treasuries, slightly below Japan. But Japan and China have been switching places off and on for the last 10 years as the largest creditor to the United States. And so it is a two-way relationship. And so I wrote about that in my book that was published in 2015 called Unbalanced, the Codependency of the United States and China. And what I found in that book, in drawing out the relationship contrast between the US and China, as seen through this framework of codependency, that it was remarkably similar to the human pathology of codependency, which is basically a very unhealthy, ultimately unstable relationship between two economic partners. I digress a little bit, but I think I just want to make this point. When two humans are in a codependent relationship, they become very needy and dependent on one another, and they lose sight of improving themselves. And ultimately, one partner decides that this is not the best way to manage his or her life and starts to change. And the other partner feels scorned and responds with anger, and the anger escalates to conflict, and ultimately the relationship can be ruptured and there can be a breakup. And that is what has happened with the United States and China. China began to change its economy right around 2007. At the time, the former premier of China, Wen Jiabao, spoke in March of 2007 of an economy that was strong on the surface, but beneath the surface was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. And China began and embraced a new strategy of structural change, rebalancing away from the model that delivered economic recovery, exports, investment, to one that was increasingly focused on developing consumer-led growth. This was a shift in the model, and it was a shift in the terms of engagement between the United States and China, and the United States was uncomfortable with that change. And that discomfort manifested itself increasingly in the form of raising objections to many characteristics of the Chinese model that we were uncomfortable with, whether it was on the trade front, the technology front, the cyber front. Many of these complaints were perfectly legitimate. Many of them were exaggerated and really were not based on sound economic analysis. But the point is that as China changed and America sort of stayed with the model that we felt was of great success, that codependency became a relationship of conflict, precisely as the psychological pathology would have predicted. It's going to be extremely difficult if we continue to escalate the conflict, having relied on one another so much over the preceding 35 to 40 years. We will find ourselves undoing a lot of the mutual gains that we have realized in coming together, and there will be considerable costs to both nations and to the rest of the world. And so I think I would conclude with this sort of first point, that in the United States, we are making a big strategic mistake in overlooking the downside of a conflict with China, operating under the false presumption that we did so well in the first Cold War, we know how to win Cold Wars. And just as we did against the Soviet Union, we'll do the same against China. And I think this is a classic false narrative. We are deluding ourselves in projecting our success in the first Cold War into the second Cold War, and we're misreading the strength of our adversary based on our views of the former Soviet Union. There are many false narratives that the US harbors about China, and there's an equal number of false narratives that China harbors about the United States. That is actually the focus of the book that I'm working on right now. The accidental conflict that emerges from this interplay of false narratives on both sides of this conflicted, codependent economic relationship. The story, if it continues to escalate, of course, will not stop with just these this back and forth early skirmishes of a Cold War. I think we have to be clear-eyed in assessing the possibility that when you are truly engaged in a Cold War, a trade war, a war over technology, a war that includes tariffs, sanctions, restrictions on the exchange of people, belligerent comments from leaders on both sides, as we've seen recently. It harkens back to the history of clashes between rising powers and ruling powers. There's a professor, a friend of mine from Harvard, Graham Allison, who has written about this in the so-called notion of the Thucydides trap. He wrote a book a few years ago that examined major power conflicts back to the 16th century. He identified 16 of them and found that 12 of them, or 75% of them, actually ended in outright military conflict. So 75% is not a possibility that you want to take lightly if, in fact, this conflict continues to fester between the United States and China. We have dismissed that possibility altogether. There's no way, we argue, that we could go from a Cold War to a hot war for one simple and obvious reason. We live in a nuclear age with weapons of mass destruction. And I agree with that. I think there is no deliberate, conceivable strategy that would allow a Cold War, if it does continue between the United States and China, to morph into a hot war. But never is a dangerous word. We just can't dismiss adverse consequences because of our clear and deep conviction that something would prevent that from ever happening. With heightened tensions in the South China Sea, with problems in the Taiwan Straits, as Ambassador Ong alluded to, we can't rule out the possibility of an accident, a military misstep, a collision between ships, airplanes shooting one another down, and then an escalation based on that. There's a best-selling book that's come out in the last few months called 2034. The subtitle is A Novel of the Next World War. It's well written, it's pure fiction. It's written by retired US Navy Admiral James Stavridis. I've had the pleasure of listening to him. He's an expert on intelligence and cybersecurity. And he's written a fictional account that when most people put it down, they say this is exactly what's going to happen. The hope is that it is pure fiction. But as we go through this period of conflict that has already escalated, as Henry Kissinger said, into the early foothills of a Cold War, we have to make certain that we don't dismiss further escalation by just saying it can never happen. Those are dangerous words that lead to complacency and quite frankly, could set the stage for dropping our guard and allowing the accident then to occur. So what I've tried to do in the first half of this lecture to you is to underscore the escalating conflict that's occurred and to stress that because the conflict is occurring between two nations that have become so intertwined and so interdependent upon one another, that there's a lot to lose on both sides if we don't resolve the conflict. The topic of my lecture, though, is from conflict to resolution. And so now that I've probably depressed you, I would like to offer a more optimistic take in the second half of my lecture to you this morning. And I'll look at resolution by attempting to answer the following question. How do we avoid the dire endgame of a conflicted codependency? How do we get out of it? Is there a program, a series of proposals, a framework of engagement that will allow us to move from conflict to resolution? I want to start, though, with an important political point on that applies both to the United States and to China. I do economics for a living. I've done it all of my professional career. But the more I do economics, the more I realize that, you know, the problem with economists is that we assume everything else away, including politics. And by the way, that's true of political scientists. They assume economics away. But the political considerations are absolutely critical for conflict resolution. Because to move from the state that we're in right now to a more constructive engagement will require political leadership on both sides of the relationship. This is not going to be easy for political leaders in either nation right now. I'll start with the US. Ambassador Ong alluded to this when he was making his introductory remarks, that things haven't gotten a lot better under Joe Biden. I would agree with that completely. And I have to say, it's a disappointment and a surprise to me. Joe Biden, as you know, immediately after he was sworn into office on January 20th of this year, in the first 2 days, he issued 17 executive orders and attempted to reverse as many of Donald Trump's policies as possible. It was a stunning display of executive power. In those first 2 days, he ended the Muslim travel ban. He stopped construction of the border wall with Mexico. He rejoined the World Health Organization. He indicated that America would rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change and countless other things. But he did nothing to change the Trump policies with China, and has done nothing since then to change the Trump administration's policies on China. And I mean nothing, zero. All he has done is continue to escalate within the context of the framework that he inherited from his predecessor. He's done that with respect to sanctions on Chinese companies. He's kept the tariff level extraordinarily high, hasn't changed it one bit. All he said is, or his administration and trade representatives have said is, the tariff policies are under review, but they're unaltered and unchanged. Why? The reason is politics. If you look at public opinion polling in the United States, especially the polls conducted by the Pew Research Center, they will show that anti-China sentiment in the United States right now is at an all-time high, irrespective of party affiliation, demographic cohort, race, or educational attainment. This is an extraordinarily rare, if not unique, example of political consensus in a polarized America right now. Joe Biden, as you know, has the narrowest of ruling majorities in the US Congress right now, and is unwilling to risk that by altering anything with respect to this contentious policy stance on China. Chinese politics, you might say, well, how can there be politics in a one-party authoritarian state? China, as you know, is heavily steeped in a long history of political intrigue. I'd say the politics in China right now are equally polarizing with respect to the United States. There's a fierce nationalism that Xi Jinping has encouraged over the last now nearly 10 years, focused on his portrayal of the Chinese dream as a dream of rejuvenation of a great nation. In particular, focused on countering the century of humiliation that the Chinese nation suffered after the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century. And it's caused a great outpouring of pride, which is good, extreme nationalism, which is bad. Xi Jinping gave a speech just 2 weeks ago on July 1st, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. It was a speech that was boastful of accomplishments, but threatening and hostile to anyone who dares to challenge the great Chinese nation that he now leads. I want to quote to you the 2 sentences that pretty much said it all in terms of the politics of his leadership stance of China. And I quote, "We will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do that will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people." He concluded that paragraph saying, "Having the courage to fight and the fortitude to win is what has made our party invincible." So we have very difficult political considerations on both sides of this conflicted relationship. How do we get out of it? The challenge, which is considerable in light of what I just told you about the politics both in America and China, is for both sides to tone down the political rhetoric and begin to focus on common ground in rebuilding trust and take small steps in the beginning to pick the low-hanging fruit. There are still very important areas of mutual interest that can and should be addressed and done so immediately, especially with respect to climate change and global health. I would say there are encouraging signs in both of those areas right now. As I said earlier, the US has already rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change. There's an opportunity, especially with John Kerry, our former Secretary of State, leading the U.S. efforts on climate policy, having already engaged his Chinese counterparts on this, of moving together collectively for the upcoming UN Climate Summit in Glasgow later this year. We've already rejoined the World Health Organization, obviously very important in addressing the ongoing pandemic. Although I have to say, the debate over the origins of COVID, the possibility that this was an accident in a Chinese laboratory rather than a natural zoonotic occurrence, that is heated up again, and that is worrisome in that regard. There's also been recent movement on the diplomatic side with the Deputy Secretary of State in the United States, Wendy Sherman, apparently traveling to Beijing, or actually not to Beijing, let's just say she's traveling to China next week, and there's been rumors that she's setting the stage for a potential summit between President Biden and President Xi. So we're making some progress in engaging one another in picking the low-hanging fruit, and that's good. That's the first way you can begin to reestablish the mutual trust that has been lost in the last 3 years. But we need more than that. We need to really think hard about a strategic framework of engagement. And so that's really what I want to close my lecture with you tonight, and give you 3 specific proposals that I think will be important in getting us back on track, moving from conflict to resolution. First, trade. We have to come clean on trade. The trade conflict that was escalated under President Trump is flawed from the standpoint of economic theory. It is destined to be a losing strategy for the United States. It's a bilateral effort to solve a multilateral problem. What do I mean by that? Last year, the US had trade deficits with 96 countries. 96. China was the biggest, although it was smaller than it had been, but still by far the biggest. But that leaves 95 other countries that we had trade deficits with. We have a multilateral problem because we have a domestic savings problem. When countries don't save and they want to grow, they must import surplus savings from abroad and run massive balance of payments or current account deficits to attract the capital. Our savings deficit is worse than it's ever been. Last year, 2020, our domestic savings rate basically averaged 1% of GDP, 1%. So of course we borrowed surplus savings from abroad and ran massive current account and multilateral trade deficits to attract the capital. The bilateral trade war backfires them. By attempting to reduce the bilateral deficit of our low-cost Chinese trading partners, all we do is divert trade to higher-cost trading partners, and that taxes the American public. So my first proposal on trade is that we need, in the United States, to abandon this so-called phase one framework and the tariffs that drive it. Because it's the wrong approach. It's a bilateral fix for a multilateral problem. It will not work. It hasn't worked, and it will not work in the future. So as opposed to building on it, to coming up with phase two or phase three, as the Trump administration proposed, we need to abandon it altogether. And that gets me to my second point. We need to replace it with something else. And that something else must address the structural problems that were correctly put on the table by the Trump administration. Structural problems focusing on issues like forced technology transfer, innovation policies, intellectual property right protection, industrial policies, cybersecurity. These are all critically important for the United States, and they're critically important for China. The allegations that were made by President Trump's trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, in a lengthy complaint that was filed as a Section 301 complaint in March of 2018, 182 pages. Went through each of those issues and presented extremely weak evidence alleging unfair practices by China. So we did not make a good case. We do not have a good understanding of how those issues play out in the United States and in China and in other countries, but that doesn't mean the issues are not important. So we need a better framework to resolve these structural issues, not through tariffs, not through sanctions on companies, but by going back to the table and negotiating something that we had very close to finish negotiating, a bilateral investment treaty, which focuses on growth opportunities in two markets through rules-based market access that is enforceable under the correct negotiating framework. The United States currently has bilateral investment treaties with 42 countries around the world. China has bilateral investment treaties with over 100 countries around the world. We were this close to reaching agreement on a bilateral investment treaty at the end of the Obama administration. Trump, of course, canceled everything that Obama did, including a bilateral investment treaty. We need to go back to the table on that immediately. The goal is to frame a bilateral investment treaty that addresses correctly the structural issues, forced technology transfer, innovation policies, protection of intellectual property rights, industrial policies, and cybersecurity. We can do it. We were close. We need an enforceable agreement. And my third point is we have no dialogue between our two countries that is in any way whatsoever on a par with the nature of our complex, serious, threatened, conflicted relationship. The framework we've used has been episodic. It's been infrequent. We've done things like an annual or a biannual strategic and economic dialogue. It's a big summit with lots of parties. I've been to them. They have accomplished nothing. They're not worthy of the relationship. So what we need, I think, is a more serious full-time framework, what I've called a secretariat, an office housing professionals on both the Chinese side and the US side that are located in a neutral location, engaged in full-time focus on joint data gathering, policy white papers, oversight and compliance of any new or existing agreements that are reached between the two countries, and add considerable weight to the attention that both nations place on this relationship. I think the path from conflict to resolution is achievable. It will take political courage on both sides to de-escalate and to do that. But I think we, again, need to be much more clear-eyed about the consequences of escalation and the presumption that one nation has the upper hand or is stronger, or our position of moral authority and leadership is so widely appreciated that we do not need to do anything to address this conflict. The meeting that the two sides had in Anchorage, Alaska, in March of this year was truly a disaster. It's an indication of the interplay between politics and strategy, where the US opened up the meeting by lecturing the Chinese side, and the Chinese side responded with this belligerent, we call it wolf warrior rhetoric, that only underscored the type of reaction that Xi Jinping himself reinforced with his speech on July 1st, literally 2 weeks ago, in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. These are examples that were last seen truly at the height of the Cold War between the United States and China. I agree with Henry Kissinger. We are now in the foothills of a Cold War. It's time to climb back down to the ground. The odds of conflict resolution appear low right now. It will take statesmanship and leadership and political courage on both sides to get to a better place. We can and we must do better. Thank you very much for your time today. I await your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Roach, for that excellent analysis on conflict and resolution between the two most important powers on Earth today. I think you have given us a lot of food for thought. And I am looking at some of these questions, but I thought that as our participants are poring over the short question that we have asked them to offer to you, maybe I would tempt you to say a few words about how the Chinese decision makers or policy makers look at Southeast Asia. You have been here very often and you know the Chinese more than anybody we know. Yeah. How do they see this important part of their geography? The southern part of China goes into Southeast Asia, and we have ASEAN, and we have many of our ASEAN member states committed to the trade, the free trade, the trading system, the multilateral rules, and so on and so forth. How do they see, they means the Chinese side, see the ability of Southeast Asia to work with them, for China to work with Southeast Asia in their bigger scheme of things, maybe even playing a bit of a role in the evolving China-United States relationship. Just give us a quick, off the top of your head kind of reaction to this particular question. Over to you, sir.
Well, I think that the China clearly feels the need to build relationships with others in the world, especially since its most important relationship is now in trouble, the relationship with the United States. China has made an effort, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping, his signature foreign trade policy, to utilize the need for infrastructure, not just in East Asia, but in South Asia and into Eastern Europe as a vehicle to build relationships. This is a controversial initiative because there are concerns that it is a debt trap for many nations to get involved in China or with China. But I think the relationship between China and Southeast Asia is of great importance to China, in where it is at risk of losing its relationship from the West, and possibly pressures with Europe as well. And so I think the natural affinity of China to develop greater relationships with its Asian neighbors is important. Having said that, the frictions in the South China Sea are a worrisome offset to that possibility. So, I think there is a potential there for a deepening relationship, but again, that will be a challenging task to pull off. It will require people like yourselves with great diplomatic skills to be able to navigate the difficulty there as well.
Thank you, Professor Roach. One of the questions that have been sort of summarized together with a few other comments is with regard to your earlier point about missteps and accidents and what we call accidental conflict and false narratives. So one of the viewers had referred us back to the 2001 incident where, what we call the Hainan Island incident, some Chinese fighter jet collided with a US Navy intelligence gathering aircraft. So that particular incident was resolved quite cleverly by both sides, and looking forward, can this kind of actual experiences between the two sides, China and the United States of America, can it be replicated? And if so, how can we sort of work towards that? On the ASEAN side, we have this interesting idea of planning for a kind of code of conduct, and we talk about unplanned incident at sea, and so on and so forth. So the question really revolves around, is it possible for both China and the United States to look at the earlier incident and the other near incidents and develop a kind of modus operandi to prevent accidental conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I was in China precisely at the time when the incident took place in 2001. And I was actually conducting a series of visits to see senior Chinese officials with a small delegation of well-known US investors. And we had a tour bus going to see senior leaders. We had a police escort. And every time we got to a ministry, we had to wait, and because they were trying to decide whether or not they would see us in light of the difficulties that were occurring because of this incident on Hainan Island. And in each case, we were told we could not see the say the Minister of Finance. We had to see the Deputy Assistant Associate Minister of Finance, and the same was the case with the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the Minister of Commerce, and so on and so forth down the line. China was in a different state, though, in 2001 than it is today. That was the same year that we were reaching conclusion on China's bid to join the WTO. China needed the United States to support its accession to the WTO then, and now China is in a much greater position of strength than it was back then. And so the possibility of an accident today finds the state of the Chinese economy as well as its own military strength in a considerably different position. We developed a lot of, in the ensuing years since the EP3 fighter pilot incident, we developed a lot of military to military protocols in areas of cyber that unfortunately have not continued in recent years. And we need to go back and think about taking better actions to make certain that there is a protocol, a code of conduct that allows us to communicate on a regular basis to avoid escalation in the event of whether it's in the air or on the sea, accidents from turning into something far worse. We understood the stakes back then, but we understood the stakes, I think, in a tone of dialogue and communication that was far more constructive and respectful back then than it is today. And I look at the way in which we exchange views in Anchorage. I look at the belligerence of Xi Jinping's speech of 2 weeks ago, and I worry that this climate of mutual respect that existed back then has deteriorated significantly in the ensuing years, and we need to get back to that. We need to get back to that very quickly, or a replay of another accident may not go as well as it did back then.
Well, thank you for that. Following up on your comments on the codependent relationship and what you just said. So this question may be a repetitious one, but I think it's worth drawing out your thinking about it. So both sides know they are co-independent, yes, codependent, yeah. And they should know that there will be a lot of losses if both sides take the extreme measures. So isn't there some way along this line of thinking, the effort should be made to re-establish a modicum of trust and cooperation? Yet, from the latest speech by the Chinese leader and also the your analysis so far that the Biden administration has done zero to try to rearrange the relationship or re-establish the working relationship with China. How do we go forward? What is going to be your worst guess? Yeah, or what is the best guess?
Yeah.
We want to enjoy you a little bit more. Sorry about that, Stephen.
That's okay. Look, I'm struck in my discussions with the U.S. side in particular that there continues to be a belief that we can address trade on a country-by-country bilateral basis without having a deep appreciation for where the trade imbalances come from. When a nation does not save and we want to grow, we have to have trade deficits. That comes with the territory of a country that is basically living beyond its means. We've been doing that in the United States now for over 35 years. We've gotten away with it because we're the world's reserve currency, and the rest of the world continues to invest in US treasuries and other forms of dollar-denominated assets. And so we conclude that there is no problem with neglecting our saving, and we can presume, therefore, that we can segment or separate our saving issues from our trade issues, but we cannot do that. And so the lack of connection between budget deficits and trade deficits is one that continues to confound the solution of problems like US-China trade. The Trump administration was the extreme of this. He looked at a list of countries that we traded with and found that we ran deficits with China, with Mexico, with Germany. And one by one, he said, let's just put tariffs on all of them. He said, I love tariffs. I love trade wars. They're easy to win. And the tariffs are paid by the Chinese. They're paid by the Japanese. And of course, they're not. Tariffs are paid by those who import from nations that we impose tariffs on, and they're passed through from the importers to businesses, supply chains, and ultimately to American consumers. We lose in trade wars, and suppliers that are linked to the countries that we impose tariffs on, they also lose. We saw what a trade war did in the 1930s, and we are not particularly keen students of the history of that earlier period. And so this is a classic example, I think, of the arrogance of the hegemon in believing that we can take actions without broader consequences. China has played a role in this as well by running an economic strategy, a policy that has repressed consumer demand and has emphasized excess saving with current account surpluses and trade surpluses that have got the country into trouble. And this is an approach that Japan tried in the 1980s and led to a comparable period of pressure on Japan that has ended very poorly for the Japanese economy over the last 3 decades. Japan has gone from the strongest economy in terms of economic growth to an economy that has now just completed its 3rd lost decade of near economic stagnation. China has studied the Japanese example and certainly does not want to end up in the same place. But by running a policy of surplus saving and current account and trade surpluses, it's inviting pressure from the rest of the world that may not end well for China, as it didn't end well for Japan. Both the US and China will lose in an escalating conflict. There's no doubt in my mind. The US is in denial over that. I think the Chinese actually, in my discussions with the Chinese, they understand what's at stake. But we'll have to see if that understanding is something that can have an impact and shift the dynamic between the two leaders to avoid an escalating conflict.
Thank you for that. One question that I just got on my WhatsApp is that given the recent Chinese government action against tech companies in China or from China, and the earlier action against Alibaba and Jack Ma, the consciousness of the people in our ASEAN region is that, wow, so the tech companies are not state-owned enterprises in China, and if these guys go beyond a particular boundary, the authorities in China will crack the whip. So from your long years of interacting with the Chinese businesses and companies, how do you foresee this going forward? Yeah, everybody who want to get listed on the stock exchange of New York and others in the United States and the European countries now will have to follow a particular line. or at the least avoid any stepping on anyone's foot or anyone's in the state-owned enterprises or the government ministries in China. This questioner asked whether you can comment a little bit about that. Is this something going to be extended to other big non-state-owned enterprises trying to do business in our region, Southeast Asia and elsewhere, for example, in the United States?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, it's one that I'm thinking about right now as I'm writing this new book. And, I'll just give you the benefit of at least some preliminary thoughts on this that I have not fully worked out in my own mind. But I think that the Chinese leadership is making a big mistake here. If you look at the tech sector in China, whether it's, Alibaba, Ant, or, the Didi,
Really, yeah.
The car hailing service that just did an IPO in the US.
Yeah.
The government is now clamping down on what has been, over the last 5 years, the most entrepreneurial, dynamic, fast-growing, innovative sector in the Chinese economy. It's sending a chill through the new economy. This is the sector of China that, if anything, is emblematic of the animal spirits of entrepreneurialism that have been successful in the United States, and other vibrant economies around the world. I think this sends a chill in an important sector, the most important sector in China in the last 5 years. And I couple this together with my own concerns over the disappointing aspect of the consumer rebalancing story of China that I've also observed in the last few years. The government has made great success in putting in place a number of aspects of the consumer story in China by focusing on new jobs and services, raising wages through rural-urban migration, in building new cities, which generate demand for services. But the consumer has never gotten to the promised land because they're fearful of an uncertain future. They're getting old rapidly and they don't have a social safety net. And so they save out of fear. And this precautionary saving is another symptom of the lack of animal spirits that consumers in other societies like the United States draw on to commit to a more active consumer culture. And so this combination of putting pressure on animal spirits in the household sector and now the new economy tech sector is worrisome. China has reasons for this. They always have, in the tech area, they're concerned about data security. Well, I think, they have every right to be concerned about data security. But if they do this at the price of squeezing their most dynamic and entrepreneurial sector, there are consequences of those actions that I honestly do not think they are fully appreciative and aware of. So this is a worrisome development. And it's one that we need to be very mindful of in thinking about where China is headed in the years ahead. It's a great question.
Great. I think that is maybe a good thing for this dialogue between the United States and China that you advocate, yeah, and the institutions on both sides ought to look at some of these things as part of what I call the broader, bigger question, instead of us being bogged down by all these, what I call 5 cent, 10 cent problem. Yeah. But I have a last question for you, Professor, because time is almost up. In your suggestion going forward towards resolution of this contentious situation between the US and China, you have already talked about low-hanging fruits and particularly climate action. Is there a realistic chance that both China and US can actually come together and do something which will create a big impact from the next climate change summit somewhere in Scotland, I guess? Yeah. What is your best guess on this? Can it really give us the low-hanging fruit that you have advocated?
I hope so. I mean, we have right now in the United States every day examples of climate change wreaking havoc on weather conditions around our country. We've seen outbreaks of heat that, you know, even a climate like you have in Singapore, which is so close to the equator and you know how to live with heat, would be judged as extreme by your standards. We have fires right now in the west of the United States on a level that we have not seen. We've seen what we call a heat dome in the northwestern quadrant of the United States, hitting cities that don't even have air conditioning with oppressive heat. So, you know, we are moving to a point where the denial over climate change is cracking before our very eyes. We have incentives to address this and to do so with an urgency that we have not appreciated. We've always been told that climate change is gradual until it reaches a tipping point. The tipping point appears to be at hand right now. And so if there's ever been incentives to pick the low-hanging fruit, 2021 is a year to do that. And, you know, China's just embraced a nationwide carbon trading scheme. China's moving ahead on this. And shame on us if we don't join together in partnership with others, including China, who have a greater appreciation for the problem. China has horrific issues of environmental degradation that it knows full well are not sustainable for the nation. This is a point that was made by Wen Jiabao in 2007 when he raised issues of sustainability. And China has also failed to address them, and now they are. And so, yes, there is an opportunity to seize the moment, and shame on us if we don't do that together.
Thank you. I think this is what you meant by political leadership is essential. And your point about the strategic framework is critical. Yeah, we have to go beyond the little, what we call localized or personal problem with each side and look at this bigger picture and seize the moment, as you put it. Well, Professor Roach, I want to thank you very much for this wonderful masterclass, I will put it. And I don't know whether you might be aware of it, but you are now hooked into our system for the next several months. So we look forward to arranging another lecture from you for us, unless you are able to travel personally here. But otherwise, we will do one more of this online thing. I think all the members of the audience appreciate your high level analysis and candor. So thank you again, sir. We'll be in touch, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to you, your colleagues, and it's an honor to be to have the opportunity on this important platform. Thank you.
Thank you, and once again, thanks to Ngee Kongsi for facilitating and giving us this chance to meet online and to listen to Professor Stephen Roach. Goodbye now, and all the best, sir.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.